Welcome to the Heartland Daily Podcast. I'm Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for Environment and Climate at the Heartland Institute. With me today is Steve McIntyre of Toronto, Canada. You may recall that he, as well as Dr. Ross McKittrick, also of Canada, successfully debunked one of the most important papers on climate called the Hockey Stick Paper by Dr. Mann. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Well, it's nice to be here out on the ocean.
Yes, it's a rockin' good time today. We've got a little bit of wave action going on. So you were originally involved in evaluating mining claims through statistical means. How does somebody who's in that kind of a business end up refuting one of the most important, at least in their view, climate papers in the world?
Well, I got interested in climate through sheer bad luck, I think. In 2002, the Canadian government was promoting the Kyoto Treaty, and as part of their promotion, they sent a brochure to every household in Canada announcing that 1998 was the warmest year in 1,000 years, and the 1990s were the warmest decade. And I wondered in the most casual possible way how they knew that, and so I looked at the I looked at the IPCC report and noticed that the hockey stick graph was the origin of that particular promotional phrase, and I noticed that the graph was quite well designed and that they'd clearly put some thought into how they would make it look persuasive to people, and in the mining exploration business where you're raising money for projects, good graphics that are persuasive graphics are an important part of the business. So I took note of it, and I thought, they're certainly trying to they've worked on their message.
So it was simple curiosity at first.
Yeah, at first, and then my interest in it was actually, I'm thinking back now, so I started reading some of the supporting papers as well, and one of the papers that I read was by one of Mann's associate author, I wouldn't say associate, but another author by Keith Briffa at the University of East Anglia, who later becomes important in the ClimateGate emails. And he had written a paper in which the tree ring data went down, and he had showed the opposite result of the hockey stick. And
this came out within about the same year, didn't it?
Yeah, it was. In fact, it was submitted. His article was submitted probably within 2 weeks of Mann's, and in it he noted that the data went down, but he hypothesized some unknown anthropogenic factor, and said by assuming that there was some unknown factor, we therefore know that the results for all prior years were accurate. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was such garbage reasoning. How could anybody make decisions with such sort of cargo cult reasoning? So I thought, well, this is crazy. And but I didn't pursue the Briffa work at that time. I thought, well, Mann's work is the big dog in the field, and so
how do you think that Mann's work became the big dog and Briffa's work got ignored?
Well, I think that Mann gave an answer that the IPCC liked and Briffa didn't, but this actually becomes an important sub-theme in the ClimateGate emails, but we'll get to that later. But at the time, and this was kind of a sort of an odd curiosity, is that I thought, well, I'll email Mann for his data, just to take a look at it. And what prompted me to do so was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And at that time, I was I've done business in India and the Middle East, and was very skeptical of relying on claims from agents in India, I felt that they would tell somebody whatever they wanted to hear, and I was
right, all about getting the money, getting the investors.
Yeah, so I thought, I was very dubious of the Iraq War, and thought that and it seemed to be mostly a preemptive war, and I had the same kind of concept about the climate. That in a sense climate scientists were urging us to do a preemptive war on fossil fuels and on our economy, and so I thought, well, it would be worthwhile to actually cross-examine the data. So I emailed Mann and asked him for the FTP site where his data was located, and he told me that he'd forgotten where the data was.
And this is how long after the paper had been published?
This would be about 4 years afterwards, but that his grad assistant would locate it for me, and so my interest was, which at that point was very casual, was strongly picked up as a result of this, and the grad assistant said, well, he didn't. The data wasn't in any one place, but he would get it together for me. And I thought, well, this is very strange. I mean, I'm a sort of a 55-year-old, then 55-year-old Canadian businessman with the very slightest interest in this, and if it was nice of them to get it together for me, but it meant that nobody else had ever audited the data in the way that I assumed it had been done. And
a lot of people make assumptions about climate, or rather science in general, that somebody's looking at the data and making sure there's quality controls, but often that's not the case, is it?
Well, the answer to that, I think, is a bit nuanced. I think that in the review of an individual article, there's very seldom there's I think almost never an examination of the data. So for example, subsequently I was asked to review an article by Stephen Schneider at Climatic Change, and asked to see the data for the article that I was reviewing, and he said, well, no reviewers ever asked for data in 28 years of my running this magazine, so we'd need to have a editorial policy change to provide you with data. So, but that's a separate thing. But and in that case I said, well, I'm willing to, and he said if we required reviewers to look at data, I'd never be able to get anybody to review articles. I think the important point is for people unfamiliar with the academic journal process to understand the level of due diligence and what is a relevant level of due diligence. I've come to the opinion that it's unreasonable to expect unpaid reviewers to do the labor of fully replicating to do a full audit of an article. It's too much work, and people aren't going to do that. On the other hand, if you are relying on an article for major policy changes, at some point there needs to be some due diligence. The argument in the field is that the cumulative activity of researchers adds. As each researcher does work which relates to other work, that there's a cumulative body of knowledge, and that bad results get weeded out. But I think that can take quite a long time, and I think in the case of the recent paleoclimate articles and the hockey stick articles, that the specialists in the field, and there are not a lot of them, have fallen into some bad habits, but that story is a long way ahead in our interview.
So in the situation then where once you finally got a hold of the data and you started to try to replicate it using the techniques that were listed in the paper, what did you find?
Well, Yes, so I looked at the paper and read the methodology, and that was another thing that interested me because the techniques looked to me to be fairly elementary linear regression and linear algebra. And in an earlier version of myself at university, I'd studied pure math and had studied linear algebra and matrix algebra in a very advanced course when I was about 20, and could do math in an athletic way. So I thought, well, this is something that's within what I could refresh. And I thought my kids at that point had just grown up, so I had some time. Business was slow, so I thought, well, if nobody's replicated this, as evidenced by the fact that the data had to be assembled for me, I'll see if I can replicate it. And I viewed it, the analogy that I used at the time was it would be like doing an enormous crossword puzzle. And I had no particular objectives in doing it other than it would be...
It was just like a Sunday crosswords for you.
Yeah. And there were some chat line. There was a skeptic chat line that I joined just on the basis that I wouldn't say that I was skeptical, but I found that was a more interesting discussion and it was more interesting to see and the whole sort of unavailability of data seemed so peculiar to me, or the lack of prior availability seemed so peculiar to me that I thought that this might be quite interesting to do. So I posted up some comments on this chat line, and I got a couple of emails from professors. Bob Carter, the deceased Bob Carter, was one of them, who encouraged me and said, well, we don't know who you are, but you're looking at data in a completely different way than anybody else, so stick at it. And later in 2003, I was invited by a small journal to write up some of my observations, and so I contacted Ross McIntire, who lived near Toronto, because I'd written a lot in my professional life in business. I'd not written any academic articles, so I was unwilling to take on a potentially controversial topic on my own without having a co-author that was both familiar with the system and could give criticism of the ideas, because I was as aware as anybody that you can make mistakes make obvious mistakes. So Ross and I met in September of 2003. It was the very day that Hurricane Isabella passed through Toronto. Hurricanes don't normally pass through Toronto, but the end of it
Not
did.
normally, but that happened before.
Yeah. And so we met, we got along very well, and we're still friends today, and with you on the cruise on the ocean.
Yeah, it's kind of a, I guess some people that don't like us would call it a target-rich environment. But yes, it's been a long history. So you went through the data, you went through the replication process, and then...
So what I found in the first pass was a variety of sloppiness, but in the first pass I couldn't replicate the principal components calculations that in the data, or I couldn't replicate the principal components that were in the data set that Mann's graduate student had provided me, and there was very little relationship in some of the data that he provided with what I was able to independently calculate. And that was the main. There were various other problems. And when I did when I used the emulation of man's method to produce an overall reconstruction, I didn't get a hockey stick result. But the main reason why I wasn't getting a hockey stick result was because of the different principal component calculations. So Ross said, well, look, let's send the data set back to man and ask him to confirm that this was actually the data set that he used, because this is some of these things don't make sense.
Right.
And the data set, so I sent him back the data set that I had downloaded from the FTP location given by Scott Rutherford, his grad assistant, and asked him to confirm that this was what they used, and he wrote back an email saying more or less, I'm too busy and important to answer this or any other question. Please don't contact me anymore. Wow. And so we went ahead and published our...
So at that point, you had no idea whether that data was accurate or not, or the data that was used or not.
Well, I mean, and this becomes an odd story, because we then published a 2003 article which reported the various issues that we got. I mean, it wasn't as surgical as the 2005 article that later I sort of gave us prominence, but it raised some serious questions. And man's response, which is sort of orchestrated, there's a flurry of activity amongst Mann and Associates that's documented in the ClimateGate emails, but he said, well, we used the wrong data set.
And yet he wouldn't provide you the correct one at the time.
Well, what he said is that they should have asked us for, they should have used the correct one. That the correct one was on his, he said the correct one was on his FTP site all the time. Well, I had and he also said, and when they noticed problems, they should have contacted me, and that the problem arose because we had asked for the data in an Excel spreadsheet, which is, rather than the original data, Excel being a term, people who use Excel spreadsheets are perceived as being rank amateurs in the climate science world, and that he said that his assistant had made errors in preparing the Excel spreadsheet for us, unfortunately, but we should have checked with them before we used it. And then suddenly, a bunch of new directories and files materialized on his FTP site, which he said were the data that was actually used in the original study. So this was a So
at that point, did you feel like there was a purposeful obfuscation going on?
Well, it seemed very odd, that's for sure. But what struck me was not so much the obfuscation, but that there are certain just flat-out lies that were easily disproved. So, for example, we hadn't asked for the data to be put in an Excel spreadsheet. I'd asked for the FTP location of the data because I was wanting to use the data as originally used. I mean, I was approaching it from an audit perspective. So in that sense, the last thing that I wanted somebody to do was to prepare the data in a different way than it was actually used. And so I thought, well, why would he say that I'd asked for an Excel spreadsheet when I hadn't? And I could easily prove that I hadn't by producing the email that I had sent to him. And so, which we did at the time, but none of the people, none of the climate science community paid any attention. They thought that we had been amateurs, and that man's explanation was true. The other thing that annoyed me a great deal at the time was the idea that this data was online all the time. And what my belief was is that the data he had a private, the data would be online for people who knew the exact URL to access the data.
It's an FTP location. It doesn't show up in search engines.
Right, and yeah, he had a robots text that blocked indexing, and if you went in and there was no link through his website to the location of this particular data. And I had spent a lot of time sort of browsing through and sort of looking everywhere in his FTP site in September, and in the second round of ClimateGate emails, and this wasn't in the first round or it would have attracted more publicity, there was an email which he sent to Phil Jones, and this is his first mention of me in the emails, in which he described me as someone that was trying to break into his FTP site. So clearly, if he viewed me,
break into a public FTP site? That's the question.
Yeah. So I thought that rather refuted his idea that it had been online all along. So as far as from what, and the other thing that one more lie in it was that the data set that we had been provided by Scott Rutherford, I checked the file creation date on it, and it had been prepared in summer 2002, a year before my request. So the idea that this had been prepared in response to my request was, yet one more lie. So at this point I thought, well, in my experience in business, one of the one of the standard sort of one of the things that well, just sort of philosophy. It's not a philosophy, but advice is that if somebody lies about something, they'll lie about everything.
Right. And lies in small things, lies in big things.
Yes, and in some cases, I'd been in one dispute where I was advised that I was sure that a guy was lying, and they said, "Well, if you think he's lying about big things, check his expense accounts." So at that point, I thought, okay, I know this guy has made these multiple lies, but the other thing that he did is that he also technically said that our replication of his principal components had missed a stepwise procedure that wasn't described in the article, and that was how he dealt with reduced with the fact that some proxies didn't go back as far as other proxies. And he said that once that was taken into consideration, that the big difference in results that we had noticed no longer held. So while the Excel spreadsheet seemed to be something where there was, clearly a problem or clearly a sort of a transgression on his part, the fact that we had not used stepwise regression or stepwise principal components left us open to a more substantive criticism. But at that point, I thought, since he's lied about these things, he's got a new best friend, and I'm gonna find out what's really going on here. And within the directories that suddenly materialized, they were done so quickly that he inadvertently included some code for the calculation of the principal components. So which I then started parsing, and it was in Fortran, but in a sort of 40 years earlier, I'd studied Fortran at university, and I don't think I'd looked at any Fortran code.
Punch cards.
Well, literally, in terms of, I remember taking punch cards into the university lab. Anyway, I figured out what had happened, and he had not used a standard principal components algorithm
Was this one that he created on his own, or was just a mistake?
Well, a bit of both. In R, you can do a principal components calculation in one line, and that's what I'd been using. And in Fortran, he had a subroutine that calculated principal components, but
for our listeners, R is a graphical computer language, and that's what it's labeled, just the letter R.
Yeah, it's a wonderful modern language that enables you to do an awful lot of work really fast. So when I was able to isolate the difference between his principal components calculation and ours by the fact that in a principal components calculation as done by everyone else in the world, you subtract the means of each series before you do the calculation, so that you take out so that they're zeroed, that they have a zero mean before you do the calculation. What man had done was, instead of taking out the mean over the whole history of the proxy, he did what we called short centering, and he subtracted the average in the 20th century rather than, so I did some experiments with that procedure because this came as a surprise to the academic community. But what happens if you do a principal components calculation after taking the mean in the 20th century is that with random data with fluctuations in it, you will nearly always get a hockey stick result when in your first principal component. And the reason for that is that by taking if you have a series that goes either up or down in the 20th century, you then have it gets heavily weighted in the principal component calculation, and series that are unchanged in the over the whole series get very little weight. So
and this would happen whether it was tree ring data or anything, right?
Anything, absolutely. So in the practical sense, what we found was that the bristlecones, which had a big difference in between their 20th century and their prior history, got a weight of 400 times as much as a series in, say, Arkansas that just was fluctuated more or less like white noise. And so we did experiments with what we called red noise, which had the same sort of persistence properties as these tree ring things, and we found that we consistently got hockey stick shaped
with random noise.
With random noise, and so this was a big surprise to people. Now, it's now the effect. The effect can be obtained I just want to, before people sort of overthink this being related to principal components, and I would say that we ourselves were prone to this early on. This is not the only way that you can overweight series with 20th century which go up or down in the 20th century. One other way of doing it is if you just simply pick series that go up in the 20th century and discard series that go down in the 20th century.
So pre-screening.
Or not pre-screen, but sort of after the fact screening.
Okay.
And I mean, the phrase that I use is, is ex post screening. So my philosophy afterwards is that if you think that, for example, black spruce tree ring chronologies at tree line are a valid proxy for temperature, then you have to take all of them, and you have to average them and do something simple to get your result. You can't, after the fact, pick the ones that went up and discard the ones that went down or didn't do anything, because if you just simply after the fact pick the ones that went up, you will get a hockey stick through a different method. And so
they basically assumed at that point that these particular ones that they picked were proxies for temperature. But as I understand it, Liebig's law says that any plant or tree, in the way that it responds during its growth period, can respond to temperature, it can respond to sunlight, it can respond to water and available nutrients. And so how would man know that these series that he picked were truly responsive to temperature?
Well, he was relying to a considerable degree on the idea that he was using series that had been already selected as temperature proxies within literature, but his principal components method sort of changed the weightings. Now, the bristle cones become just when we were doing this, and we found that Mann's method in effect mined data and overweighted ones that had 20th century departures, and it didn't matter. In his method, principal components will flip the series so that they cohere, so that for principal components, it doesn't matter whether a series went down in the 20th century or went up in the 20th century. It'll flip the series to all match. But the active ingredient in his hockey stick was a very peculiar set of proxies called chronologies, primarily connected by a fellow named Donald Graybill, and they were strip bark bristlecone pines. Now these are very peculiar trees that have lost the bark around most of their circumference. The bark winds in a spiral around the dead core. They can live thousands of years or hundreds of years, so they provide a long record. And it was well known that their growth had increased quite sharply in the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, the primary author of the bristlecone pine chronologies was Donald Graybill, who had worked with Sherwood Idso, an arch skeptic, and they had postulated that it was CO2 fertilization that had
from the Industrial Revolution
that had caused this increase in bristlecone pine ringwoods in the 20th century, and nothing to do with temperature.
So
but I just before we leave, I want to pick up on that, because my own view on that, and this is based on some bristlecone, sort of Pete Holtzman and I and our wives later collected some bristlecone pines cores in near Colorado Springs from one of the sites that Graybill had collected, and our conclusion was that in fact some of the bristlecone pines were dead. So when you form strip bark, it's because part of the bark has been torn off, and Pete theorized that in the mid-19th century some of the lower branches were weighed down by snow and stripped off the side of the strip bark, and then that created a kind of bulge in the remaining set of the tree. So Pete found that if he did cores around the diameter of a strip bark tree, there would be a variation of up to 600%.
Wow.
Within a couple of inches, so that if you did it from the side, or depending opposite where the bulge was, you had 6 sigma variations in some of these cores. And so what was happening in the chronologies is there would be enough of these 6 sigma results that when they were averaged with the others, they give 150% increase or 160% increase, but these 6 sigmas were not in any sense a temperature proxy. So the whole rationale for bristlecones as being some sort of magic thermometer was almost certainly is completely bogus. And yet what the Mann reconstruction at the end of the day is essentially it reproduces the shape of these bristlecone chronologies and all the other multi-proxies that are advertised, the tree rings from other places or ice cores or are nothing more than noise. They all, there's no signal in them whatever, and like in the central limit theorem for noise, sort of the noise cancels out, and what emerges is the shape of the bristlecone pines, which has got nothing to do with temperature.
So you were armed with this knowledge that the data itself was faulty and questionable. You were armed with the knowledge that the principal component analysis yielded hockey sticks even if you fed it random noise. And if I recall correctly, armed with this knowledge, you and Ross McIntire went before the National Academy of Sciences and spoke about this.
Well, actually, there's one other item which let me bring up because it's important. Well, we first submitted an article to Nature after we figured out the principal components, and Mann's reply, and I mention this because this lingers on into Mann's libel suits against Mark Stein and National Review. Mann said, well, the reconstruction that was being when we did a calculation with a proper principal components method and didn't get a hockey stick result after we found out how he did his principal components, and we showed that the bristlecone pines, instead of being the first principal component, were in fact only about the 5th principal component, and under Mann's retention policies wouldn't factor into the ultimate reconstruction. So, and we just simply showed the effect of a proper principal components calculation. Or when I say proper, it's not. I'm not sort of saying that there is a right way of. I'm not saying that doing principal components on tree ring networks necessarily yields anything valid. But if you didn't use if you used a less bad method than Mann's principal components, that you got a different
something more of an accepted industry standard.
Yeah,
kind of a
yeah. If you did what people thought that he was probably doing, you didn't get the result. Well, he said, well, the result that, and we didn't propose that as an alternative reconstruction, but Mann represented it as though we were presenting it as an alternative view, and he said, well, your calculation doesn't meet verification statistic standards, and that you have an RE value of minus 0.3, whereas my reconstruction has a RE of 0.5, and so therefore your alternative should be rejected. And this seemed like an odd argument because we weren't arguing that the squiggle that we had calculated using a sort of better implementation of his methods was in any sense right, but the Nature people required us to calculate verification statistics. So I consulted the statistical texts that Mann had cited for not just what verification statistics they used, and the most common one was a verification R-squared statistic, and they calculated an RE statistic. For the purposes of your audience, I'd say it doesn't really matter what these statistics are, other than they were standard in the industry. I calculated the various statistics, both for sort of our implementation of his method and his implementation, and discovered something very surprising, that the verification R2 statistic, which was a totally standard statistic for man's early steps, was almost zero, which is an abject failure. I mean,
you need a value of greater than 0.9 typically, right?
Well, I mean,
to say that it's valid,
or 0.9 would be, you could work with 0.4, 0.5, but certainly
the higher the number, the better.
Yeah, we got 0.018 for the early step of man's reconstruction, and for later steps, some other authors found that it was 0.00003 for the 1700 step. So we reported this back in our reply to Nature, and this becomes a huge battleground. This starts a long and entirely separate battle, because in addition, so it seemed implausible to me that he hadn't calculated a verification R2 statistic, because Cook and Peters calculated it, and Fritz calculated it in their standard tree ring reconstruction texts, and so it would be second nature to do it, and in other articles, man had calculated it, and when I looked at the supplementary information to the original study, he had said in the text that they had considered verification R and verification R2 statistics, but they weren't included in the supplementary information. And at that point, I knew that they were, close to zero, and this very adverse data wasn't anywhere to be found.
So it was clear to you that they knew those values and didn't report them.
Yeah, so in our Nature correspondence, we didn't make a big deal of it, but in 2005 we got Nature ultimately didn't accept our article. They said it wouldn't be of interest to their wider audience.
Yet this hockey stick was being used as a policy, item.
But actually, we had got, in our first submission, we got good reviews, and we were got essentially what's called a revise and resubmit. So, and then they added a third reviewer who was, I think the Nature editors were a little taken by surprise that we got favorable initial reviews, and so they added a third reviewer who I believe to have been Phil Jones, and who sort of deep sixed the article. Now, and two of the reviewers subsequently identified themselves to me. One was Ian Jolliffe, who is a very prominent specialist on principal components, and he said that he found Mann's arguments unconvincing. And another was Eduardo Zurita, who later said that the information on, if he fully understood the verification R2 things, that the original Mann article would not have received the prominence that it did, and he very much regretted his role in not accepting our article. He was very apologetic about it. He said it was one of the worst mistakes he ever made. Anyway, we submitted a different version. I guess there was sort of an underground interest in our article. Richard Mueller wrote a...
This is of Berkeley, Richard Mueller.
Yeah, but years before, he wrote an article in October 2004 for MIT Review on sort of the dispute we were having with nature, and that he was very much on our side, and so I corresponded with him, and he suggested that I come out to the AGU meeting in 2004, which I did, and he was sort of invited me over for dinner. He's the only climate scientist to this day that's ever invited me over for dinner. But in 2005, so we published two articles, one in GRL, which got most of the attention, another one in E&E, Energy and Environment. In that one, we talked about the omission of the verification R2 statistics, and with my experience in business prospectuses, I said this. I took the view that in businesses, when you are when you are communicating with the public, you are required to make full, true, plain disclosure and to include all adverse information and clearly disclose it. And I thought in the IPCC process, scientists are not merely communicating with one another, but they are communicating to the public. And
right.
So in the absence of any formal standards for what is acceptable communication, or what are standards for communication for scientists to the public, I thought that they should at least comply with the standards applicable to mining promoters, and on the basis that most climate scientists would view themselves as adhering to much higher standards than mining promoters.
One would think.
And the academics interpret that as saying, well, you're saying that my businessmen are more honest than scientists. No, I'd say no. I'm saying exactly the opposite. I'm saying that the standards are set for business promoters on the basis that, left to their own, that they are likely to shade the truth if they have an opportunity, or may do, but it's a form of regulation that to protect the public, and that scientists should adhere at least that minimum standard, and hopefully better. So I said that the omission, if man calculated the verification R2 statistics, that they should have been disclosed, and if he didn't, then that's something that the review of his paper was incomplete, and that the peer review was not such that the relevant level of peer review for publication in an academic journal was not a talisman of truth. It didn't, and that there should very well be some additional level of due diligence before you distribute to the public the results of a study with such limited due diligence. So, and that was expressed in fairly strong words in our E&E article. Now, the E&E article got zero attention in the academic community, but we were given a front page article in the Wall Street Journal at the time, and I got my picture on the front of the Wall Street Journal, which was very pleasing to my mother and other people.
I'm sure.
Sort of many far more successful businessmen than me hadn't got that. So, and that attracted the interest of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, who then sent man questions, and this leads up to the NAS panel that you asked about. But they asked man questions like, did you did you calculate the verification R2 statistic, and what was the result? And I'd also, in the Wall Street Journal interview, I talked about that I thought there might well be other problems with MANS, but he'd refused to provide source code, and without that it was hard to tell exactly what he did. And so the House Energy Committee asked MAN to also produce the source code. And MAN sent back a very snippy response saying that his source code was his personal private property, and which seemed odd since it had been paid for by the public, and it was, if anything, university property, not personal property. But he grudgingly...
That's an extraordinary claim, that he would call it his personal property.
Oh yeah, just and he said that, and he evaded the question about whether he calculated the R2. He just said the R2 is not a good statistic, and we didn't use it, without answering the question about whether he'd calculated it. But the source code that he put online, I parsed that, and it showed that he had calculated this statistic, which closed an uncertainty from our original article. I mean, we're just, I'd surmised that he'd calculated it and not reported it, but I didn't know that. So now I knew that he had calculated it and hadn't reported it. Well, the questions from the House Energy Committee resulted in irate responses from the AAAS, the AGU, the European Geophysical Union. They all were extremely offended that a congressional committee would ask questions of a climate scientist, even though MAN had willingly testified to a Democrat committee 2 years earlier. So it wasn't like they'd picked on MAN. MAN was somebody that had already turned to the jurisdiction of congressional committees by appearing before them and insulting them. So they were, as far as I was,
in the vein of how dare you ask these questions.
Yeah, so I thought that they were quite legitimate, and if anything, I thought that MAN and his allies should actually take the opportunity of being polite and presenting their case and trying to persuade the people on the committee of the importance of their views, rather than preaching to people that already agreed with them.
Interesting.
Resulting from those questions, the National Academy of Sciences wrote to the Energy Committee saying, well, if you're interested in a verification R2 statistic, we'd be happy to write a report on what's going on and advise you on this. And ultimately the Science Committee asked the National Academy of Science, or NAS, to do just that, and that led to the NAS report. Now they changed the NAS report. The National Academy changed the terms of reference from the questions that the Science Committee asked. The Science Committee got mad at them for changing the terms of reference and not answering the questions that they'd asked, and they ultimately refused to pay the National Academy for the study that had been done. So they had to eat
Talk
that.
about old boys club, boy.
Yeah.
Kind of things. This is not science. Science is supposed to be transparent. Science is supposed to be able to ask hard questions of other scientists, and it's supposed to be replicable. And as far as I can tell, based on what you've described, none of that was applicable here.
Well, yes, and well, I think you're over editorializing on it. I mean, this is a much of this, I think, is particular to MAN himself, rather than to an entire field. And,
to the larger science. Okay.
Yeah, and I was a bit unlucky in terms of the particular opponent that I had for my late career entry into the field, who And I think but I think the problem that man was facing at that point was that he knew, like I'm pretty sure he had a guilty conscience about this. I mean, I think he hadn't. He knew that he had these bad results. The reason he didn't report them in his article was, in my opinion, because they were bad, and it would. In fact, there's a ClimateGate email which didn't attract a whole lot of attention at the time, but which I thought was very important. Tim Osborne of CRU in 2003, this is just before I arrived on the scene, wrote to Mann asking for the residual series for several of for earlier steps of his reconstruction, which is the results that you need to calculate things like a verification R2 without having to repeat the entire process of collecting the data and trying to figure out every detail of Mann's poorly described method so that you could get to your own calculation of verification R2, where Mann would then say you made some mistake along the way in replicating his method, which you could easily do. And Mann replied to Osborne sending several of the verification series, which he later refused to provide to me, but he provided them to Osborne on condition that under no circumstances was Osborne to allow these series to fall into the hands of somebody who might use them the wrong way, and describing these series as his, quote, dirty laundry.
Oh my.
And so when I later asked for what he had described to Osborne as his dirty laundry, needless to say, he refused to provide it to me, and it always bewildered me in the later ClimateGate investigations that none of the inquiries asked Mann about his dirty laundry.
Seems incomplete to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, in summary here, for the entire hockey stick episode, we had a publication that became internationally known, was used with the IPCC, was used to predicate policy changes worldwide because we had a crisis in the making, supposedly. And you and Mr. McIntire put the brakes on this by saying, wait a minute, the statistics aren't right. You took it to Nature, you took it to the National Academy of Sciences, and people said, yeah, the statistics aren't right. The methodology's got problems, the data's got problems. What was the end result of all of this?
Well, I would say nothing. I mean, Mann's reaction was that he could save his results by adding in more principal components to include the bristlecone pines, and the bristlecone pines, they just kind of ignored the whole problem about bristlecone pines. And a couple of his associates published an article which their code replicated our emulation of Mann. So we were totally file compatible in terms of our results, and so their code, they also found that Mann's verification R2 was 0. But instead of saying that they confirmed our results, they said that they confirmed Mann's results.
My goodness.
Right. But on a larger issue, and others, what Mann and others will say is, well, since then there have been multiple other studies which also get a hockey stick shape that don't rely on the principal components. And our original criticism was limited to Mann's study. So even if we completely show that Mann's study was flawed or fatally flawed, that doesn't show that some later study with a hockey stick was fatally flawed. Now they tend to, each of them has other problems. You know, I mentioned the ex post screening. They all rely on ex post screening. So none of the results are valid. But at the end of the day, I would say that even if we couldn't make temperature reconstructions for the past 2,000 years, people are entitled to worry about climate. It still remains an issue.
Right. That
the truth or validity of the hockey stick doesn't settle climate policy. So, yeah, I find it interesting. I find the mathematical issues interesting. I find the proxy issues interesting. I'll finish. I think the final moral of the story, and this was presented. This was something, and I'll give this will be a news scoop for your listeners today, because I haven't told the story before. Was that in 2006, a prominent young scientist came to me and said that she was convinced that our analyses had shown the limitations of the man-type climate methodologies, and that the limitations of tree ring proxies and the attempts to recalculate temperature with the tree ring proxies, and said the only way forward would really be to develop new and better proxies, and that might take 15 or 20 years for that to happen. And she asked that her name not be disclosed for personal reasons. I think she's recently explained that she wanted to see how the literature played out, and she didn't want her name used in that. The scientist and I've honored that request for confidentiality for many years, despite many opportunities that would have been helpful to at least sort of cite somebody influential that endorsed our view. And I recently wrote to her and asked for permission to use her name, and she granted it. And the scientist who agreed with our analysis, our criticism of man's work, was Valerie Masson-Delmotte, who is now the chairman of IPCC Working Group 1.
Oh my, that's quite a revelation. And do you think she's carrying that skepticism over those kinds of results forward, or have they been sort of swept under the rug with the literature?
Well, she's reliant on the literature. So the WG1 report that she is chairing will record what's in the literature, which is by and large a continuation of the Mannian style proxy reconstruction. So, but it at least shows that there's at least some lack of conviction, I think, on the part of some senior IPCC people in that, but not enough to. But their obligation is to document what's in the literature, as opposed to substituting their own views in individual chapters. But it also shows that the argument is that on our particular issues is far from as settled as represented by zealots.
Thank you, Steve, for that fascinating story about you and how Ross McIntire struggled over years to bring truth and science out into the open. That concludes our podcast for today. If you get a chance, please visit us on iTunes and give us a positive review if you can. I'm Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for Environment and Climate at the Heartland Institute.